A lot of different ideas, I think, interesting ideas raised by the panellists. I'm going to come straight out to you, see any comments you've got.
Yeah, my name's Martin Lote. Question or point maybe seem a little bit lightweight after the very moving, important comments by the last speaker. But the problems are well identified, and I particularly want to talk about antisocial behaviour, things like littering, which really concern me. What can actually be done? Should we look to the state or teachers or police or authorities to send some top-down changes of pronouncements? I'd be very interested to explore what people can do themselves and create cultural moves and shifts which make these things socially unacceptable. It's a bit like the way perhaps drinking and driving has moved over the last 10, 15 years, certainly in my lifetime. I'd love to know what the panel or other people think about whether people can start their own popular movements. And I believe from my PR experience and also a campaign I helped to chair, which was successful in changing the law, civil partnerships for everyone, if you're interested, is you can create a movement with online petitions, social media, public meetings and so on, and get people to change their behaviour. Or more importantly, get the people around them to see that there's enough people have changed their behaviour that they are now in the minority and they should change too. And I go to the point about music on public transport. For example, you see women on public transport with baby on board signs. It communicates to everyone that they might need to have a seat. I'm wondering if there's room for things like badges, like if I want to hear your music, I'll ask for it, or something like that. So if you're on a carriage at night and you see that there's 20 people there, one person playing music and 17 people have got that badge on, you'll feel a little bit more confident than Luke did in taking them on.
At the opening session on yesterday morning, I think it was Jacob, he spoke about the hostile state, a state which seems to be on every level acting against the interests of the people. And this seems to be a symptom to me of a hostile state. It's not about individuals. We don't have the trust to do things. So I don't want to start wearing badges, to be frank, because I don't trust that I will be supported and defended by the agents of the state, the police, but also the judges, every aspect. And I think it sounds as if Ireland is getting there as well. And so it's a question really, how can we work to get a state which is supportive of the people of this country?
It seems to me the very basic thing of a state is that it protects its citizens and has law and order. You think, the Italian city-states, how does the modern state even come into being? It basically just had this basic premise that we will protect the citizens within our walls. And so it does seem to me this is a really huge problem in that we no longer have a state that seems to be able to do the basic of a state, which is to have law and order and protect its citizens. And it's really profound, isn't it? And you just think, and that seems to me, to the last speaker's point. So, for example, when Blair outsourced prisons, you just think, we outsourced our criminal justice system. We outsourced prisons as if Serco could do it, as if it was a technical issue, as if not talking about law and order, punishment, rehabilitation. It's central to a discussion of a functioning state. So somehow we need to bring it back, or a state has ended, I would say.
Hi there. My name's Steve. So in answering your question, do we think it's lawless? And then some of the points that you raised, and I have a question for you. I remember being raised as a kid where we had Bobbies on the beat, and the parents policed us, and teachers were trusted, and now everyone's frightened to challenge anyone's parents or anything. I served in the army as a signaller in a police headquarters with Special Branch in Northern Ireland during the Troubles. Not getting into right or wrongs or anything like that. And one of the great ironies is on social media is actually the tricolour and the Union Jack are flying together in the race the colours thing, where everyone's seeing the same problem. And if it brings about peace between us in that way, then great. But crucially, that operation was about restoring law and order. A lot of people don't understand that. And that was a complete breakdown, civil war, on the cusp of civil war. The police had to walk the streets. They were the bravest policemen and women I've ever seen. They had to walk the streets in the open. They lived in their communities. They had to be seen to be walking without impedance down the street to show that the state was in control. The army's job was to protect them. And we don't have that on our streets. So to give you some examples of my opinion of, is it lawless? I work in the City of London. Good luck crossing a road and try not to get mown down by a cyclist or anyone. Some do obey the law, a lot don't. But if you want to see a complete free-for-all on red light, just go to the city on any day of the week and just stand there and see it for yourself. Don't take my word for it. Go and look at it. There are no police around, and it is a total free-for-all of delivery drivers and affluent, or any background people in suits taking a mick with bikes from London Bridge right up to the city. The shop at the end of our road in Beckenham used to look like a shop. Sainsbury's now looks like a bank. It's got they're behind armoured barriers on it. And we're in an area where a friend of mine down the road near Croydon it's like Toontown compared to where he is, where just down the road, it's, you need an XL bully, and Croydon looks like a war zone. Go to Croydon town centre now, it's like 28 days later. A Somali Uber driver, lovely lady, was moving her kids from East London to Kenya because it was safer, because of the gangs in East London. So this is not anecdotal. And then over in the States, by the way, I've worked out in the States a lot in my career. I saw San Francisco go from one of the nicest cities in the US to an absolute shithole. I'm not doing it. A Canadian friend of mine working in Portland just before lockdown, one of the most loveliest places in North America, turned into a lawless hole. And they're actually going in there with the military and police with armed guns to restore order. So my question, given that we are too frightened to do anything and teachers don't have the authority to do anything and we've lost respect for everything and the government doesn't do anything and we've lost that trust, which is alluded to as well, that trust factor. When the head of the Special Forces writes an open letter in a country magazine last year saying my guys are questioning whether they should go in and risk their lives to enforce your laws because you guys are going to sue them, Keir Starmer, we've got a problem. So law and order is the question, should we bring in zero tolerance? Do we require officers with guns to go into the places that we are frightened of? And it's the same across Europe as well in a lot of places. And if so, how do you get the woke rot out of the establishment to even achieve that?
Thank you. So there's a lot of ideas already on the table for discussion. I think what is the role of the state? What is the role of individuals? What is the role of the police as part of the state? And where does judgment fit in are some of the key questions. So I asked maybe if we go down the panel this way to give your thoughts. You don't have to answer everything, but initial thoughts.
I think that one of the fundamental problems we have in Ireland is that the government has, basically spent the last several years turning everything it can find into an asylum centre when we're desperately in need of new prisons. So one of the reasons I think that as I alluded to, the sex offenders walk free from jail, having watched videos of like toddlers being raped, is that the judges don't just there's a precedent in Irish law from 2006 called DPP versus Loving. That comes from Carl Loving, was a American child sex offender in terms of being in possession of child pornography, and he basically appealed his sentence, and the Court of Appeal made a precedent under the now retired Judge Finlay, which said that in circumstances where somebody caught with those disgusting images, and I have heard things that I cannot tell you. I've heard things that keep me up at night that these people do to children and that these scumbags enjoy. He said that in the absence of previous convictions, like a relevant previous conviction for the same thing, in the absence of aggravating factors like distribution or production, a judge in Ireland is obliged to consider a suspended sentence for somebody like that. And I think one of the reasons that it happens so often is that we just don't have prison spaces. Like, I'm hearing that there are cells where there are prisoners on mattresses, and look, the government just wants to turn everything into an asylum centre right now, and like our justice system is struggling.
One thing that I think is interesting, because a couple of people have alluded to it, is there clearly was some kind of moment that came with the pandemic when lots of these norms kind of broke down and they haven't properly recovered. And I think it's worth thinking about what happened then. I mean, a few people have mentioned schools. It is worth saying in my previous life, I was Director of Strategy at Ofsted and a Special Advisor in the Department for Education.
up to the pandemic, behaviour in UK schools was the best it had been in decades, right? This was coming from teachers directly, people on the front line, some of the Gove reforms, some of the reforms under New Labour working in the city schools had done a really good job. And then it was lost very quickly, which shows how fragile this stuff is during the pandemic. And one of my sort of wider theses, not just about law and order, is that we perhaps didn't spend enough time after the pandemic thinking about what we needed to do to get things back to normal again. We'd had kids being educated at home for ages. The normal rules had gone out of the window. And I wonder if it's still not too late to have that kind of reset moment. Because the one thing I would say is interesting is, I think the gentleman who mentioned the US cities is entirely right there, except for the fact that some of them have now started to improve. So San Francisco, if you speak to people, certainly, I know exactly what you meant, particularly straight after the pandemic, 2022 was, places like the Tenderloin district in San Francisco just didn't feel safe at all to go to. They now seem to have come out of the other side. And part of it is that Liberal district attorneys have lost re-election and they've started enforcing things like shoplifting as well. But I think it does show you can get out of this, and I think a little bit more kind of looking at what's happened there, because I also felt I think one of the most important things that you said was around the shops putting up the protective glass stuff, because it's another barrier between people, right? And it has a dual effect. Yes, I understand why the shopkeepers do it, and they have every right to feel safe, but it's another barrier that you put up between people, which also makes shoppers feel less safe because they know why it's gone up as well. And the more we can try and find ways to tear them back down or make people feel safe enough to take them down, the better.
Yeah, just following on from your point about the pandemic, actually, I was thinking about it when the first gentleman spoke about how can we enforce littering or stopping loudspeaker music. And I was thinking about how interesting it was for me that during the lockdown, I disagreed with a lot of the lockdown rules, like the mask wearing and the excessive queuing and so on and so forth. In a way, I was engaging in antisocial behaviour because I wasn't bothering with a lot of that stuff. But I was fascinated by how quickly people's behaviour changed during that time, that kind of overnight, everybody sat separately on the tube, everybody did the queuing, and even when those rules were lifted, they still did it. And to me, that really showed you how if you have a strong kind of health promotion campaign or just a public some of the tactics I didn't agree with, the excessive shaming around it. It was very hard to not follow those rules because you were really shamed. But I thought, wow, if we did something similar or just even anywhere near as close to that with some of these more antisocial behaviours that people are talking about now with loudspeaker music and so on, it could really work. If you think about the kind of posters that Sadiq Khan puts up in London about be kind, or be inclusive of transgender people and so on. But where are the posters saying, what will happen if you litter or what will happen if you play loudspeaker music? I don't know if that would work, but it's a start, right? It brings some sense of authority back, and you could point to the poster. If you see somebody playing loudspeaker music, you could point to the poster and say, look, have you seen this? I don't know if it would work, but it would be something. So I do think people's behaviour can change when there is pressure, because we saw it in COVID and it was kind of people's behaviour changed so dramatically. It was kind of a bit weird. So I do think there's something to be said for that.
The first speaker at the front asked the question about how can we reclaim responsibility in local communities and how can we as ordinary citizens enforce what would be termed informal controls. I must admit, I think it's easier said than done. Occasionally I've spoken out to people on sort of public transport if they've been annoying me, but you just sort of get a mouthful back. And that is what inhibits people, I think, from acting in a way whereby you're trying to sort of lay down norms. Because as soon as you try to impose a standard on somebody else, people do get affronted, because the consequences of a therapeutic culture is you are not allowed to be judgmental, or you're not even allowed to lay down a marker by saying what you're doing is wrong or what you're doing is intensely annoying. You see that all the while against people who face the public in workplace situations. Being asked for a bus fare is an affront for some teenagers getting on a bus, because it's like, how dare you ask me for this, etc., etc. And I think that inhibits ordinary citizens from attempting to reclaim kind of moral responsibility. But, I don't think we should shy away from it completely, but that's where the cultural shift has to be. There has to be a change in terms of how the state operates, but also giving us the confidence to try to instill some form of informal controls. The harder question is, how can we push the state to protect us? How can the social contract be renewed? And I think that is a very sort of difficult question, because I remember about 4 or 5 years ago, the then Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, on 3 occasions, she wrote to the College of Policing saying you must stop non-crime hate speech. And they still go on. Obviously, Yvette Cooper wanted to strengthen non-crime hate speeches, but when you had an elected politician telling the police you've got to scrap this, and it was completely ignored, it's really hard to work out how we can push the state in that direction.
I think just on the littering point in particular, as a neighbourhood bobby, I sort of viewed myself as a sheriff of Clapham Common and Aberville Road, basically. And my philosophy, very much inspired by Bill Bratton, obviously the commissioner who turned around New York City, was the broken windows kind of philosophy. And the idea that if I walk past something that is either antisocial or breaking the law, and I don't challenge that, then I'm not just am I sort of turning a blind eye, I'm actually promoting it. Because what message does that person, oh, God, I can toss a fag packet without even the copper saying a word. And so I became pretty infamous pretty quickly in Clapham Common for challenging people for littering. So, there was a young lad came out of a house on the estate and dropped some litter just as he was walking up the street. Well, I was on him. And a whole sort of, whole army of people come out the woodwork. Oh, leave him alone, he ain't done nothing, la, 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 la. Well, I'll make the point that this young lad had dropped litter. I don't know about you guys, local residents on the estate, but I'm your local bobby. Do you want to live in a hovel? Is that what you want? Is that acceptable? And the crowd mentality actually turned. So again, even as a police officer, I think there's this sort of defeatism among a lot of officers. Partly, again, the product of the training they receive, a product of the philosophy that, well, crime is a bit like the weather, we should report it but not really change it. That's the kind of zeitgeist, right? Not helped by, as Fatima points out, lack of prison places. Absolute lack of prison places. And so one of the things that must absolutely happen in the future is a big expansion of the prison estate. We also need, as per one of the other sessions at the Battle of Ideas, we need to get our prisons working properly. That's a whole other conundrum with parallels with this. But for me, a good neighbourhood bobby would obviously set standards rather than just walk past them. They wouldn't go off and spend hours in care homes gyrating and dancing as you can find on TikTok. When I fire up the Met Police, and I tried for a while to sort of get a bit of a thing going where we'd celebrate local good police coppering. Incredibly hard to find. Social media are awash with, we've got a leaflet stall outside the tube station. Well, I don't know about anyone in this room, but I don't want the cops leafleting. I want the cops arresting people. I want people getting stopped and searched and knives taken off the street, because I know what the opportunity cost is of going off and having endless meetings and endless pathological listening sessions with people, right? Trying to understand how you tell me how I should do my job. Well, that's no good. You're a copper. You've got a warrant card. You're the only one in, I don't know if there are any coppers in the room. Anyone brave enough to put their hand up, but probably not. But if there was one here, I'd say, well, you've got a warrant card. We should be expecting from the police to be using the powers attached to that warrant card to do what we all are paying through taxes and everything else back to the social contract, what we should be expecting them to do. So for me, that's one thing. And then secondly, how do we start to try and stop some of the rot? Well, the promotion processes for policing, and I've been through a few of them. I made it up to inspector. The one recurring question at every single step of the process: what are your thoughts on how to improve equality and diversity in policing? Not tell us a time where you've fought crime or made a street safer or tackled burglary or tackled antisocial behaviour or tackled littering, tackled dogfouling, tackled speeding, tackled sexual assaults, tackled digital images of children and all the rest of it. None of that. They're not interested in that. I cannot emphasise enough the progressive capture of policing. And of course, it's a very comfortable existence. You get up the chain and all of a sudden, I'm not even accountable for crime anymore. And so one of the things that I'll be doing with SafetyScore, and I encourage anyone to have a look, is to start introducing some incentives and feedback loops around accountability on crime among senior officers.
Yeah, so I'm a probation officer in South London. I might have kind of come across people,
I've done a few visits.
And yeah, since New Labour, the prison population has more than doubled. So we've got nearly 90,000. That's the capacity, 90,000. And so in my probation unit, we are trying to keep people, well, they're being kept out of prison because there aren't the places. The other thing that's happening with the announcement this week that there'd only be 2 places in, I think, London where there are 24-hour police offices open, is that we have no money left. So probation is really starved of money. The people that commit a lot of the crimes are a small cohort who commit those crimes. And, it's acquisitional crime. They're shoplifting for drugs because we've got a massive problem with drugs. But we've got no money, and we've got some people who've got not great experience working with people with drug problems, and we've got a massive mental health issue, and nobody wants to deal with these people because everybody's trying to restrict who they've got because they haven't got any money. So you have to be really, really mentally ill to get any kind of service. So it's a race to the bottom. And with the sentencing review, Gawk's sentencing review, they're going to get rid of 12-month sentences because they don't work. And they're going to put in place more tags, so more people on electronic tags in the community. They are going to stop people go to football matches as a means of punishment. So there's more community stuff happening, and it's broken. And there's not enough resources as well, not enough staff in all of these areas. So how do we fix it?
Thank you. That's very interesting. Question about personal defense equipment, that especially for women, there is constantly women being harassed by, it's mostly immigrant men that are harassing them in London, not all the time. I hear it from my friends constantly. And you've got rape alarms, you've got criminal identifier sprays, defensive jewellery you can buy. What is the advice and the laws around personal defensive equipment?
I wanted to say, do you think that the lack of economic opportunities and jobs is increasing crime? And also, do you think that the decline of, I don't know if what I was saying would make sense, but I'll just say anyway, do you think that the decline of morality in this country has increased crime? And also, I also have a quote. I'll just say it anyway. The quote is that idle minds are the devil's workshop. And do you think that would relate to this conversation?
I was wondering on your thoughts about the rise of crime also being a state capacity issue, insofar as it seems now that the only group which are allowed to legitimately enforce the law is the police, whereby there's this kind of latent fear that if people are acting unsocially, you'd be arrested for assault or for having kind of created the conflict by trying to enforce social norms. When actually, if you think about the P-like principles of the police, that's so tyrannical and just completely authoritarian, because the point of the police in its fundamental principles was meant to just be a professional body to enforce the civic norms which people already had and could do themselves. And therefore, I was wondering what your thoughts were about this kind of culture of it's only being legitimate to enforce law if it's the state that is doing it, rather than allowing actively persecuting members of the public who are actually enforcing these norms. And the reason I say this is I remember growing up, always being told, if you act antisocial on a train or something, or in a pub, someone would come and whack you one. And as a teenage boy, that was always something which actually was very resonant with me in terms of making sure I behaved myself. And that kind of attitude now would be seen as heinous. How dare someone enforce a social norm or stand up to someone who's acting inappropriately on the tube?
I just want to say that my mum, when we saw someone dropping litter, I remember my mum saying, "Excuse me, I think you've dropped something." And you don't have to be aggressive in the way that you kind of enforce social norms, which is not dropping litter. But I feel like that was a cultural norm in the past, that's what people would do, would be to say, "Excuse me, I think you've dropped something." My question to you as well is, has that norm gone?
I think one of the things we need to do is restore our civic pride. And I think I live in Liverpool. I'm not a Scouser, but the sense of civic pride in Liverpool is very strong. And I think Liverpool as a major UK city is about 10 years behind London and Manchester and other cities. I also, my wider family are from the Isle of Man. And when I go back, it's a 20-minute flight. the sense as you get off the plane, off the ferry, is palpable. There is, there is an immigrant, population on the Isle of Man. The very large East European, Filipinos. So it's not just a pure, still the Isle of Man, but the sense of civic pride. The police are very trusted. There is this sense of community, and by restoring that, you restore this sense of community, I think.
I live in Northamptonshire, and there was a story once on BBC Northampton not that long ago, and the woman she dropped a cigarette whilst having a fag at the filling station. The brains involved in having to smoke with a BP garage is maybe your lukewarm test, Fatima. But she went running off to BBC to say this was outrageous that she'd got this because she'd picked it up after she'd been challenged and put it in the bin, and said it was outrageous that she had this £75 fine. But what was more interesting was the telephone calls that were coming in. What the British public listening to that radio station wouldn't want to do with that woman was there was no sanction too great. If they'd got hold of her, she'd have been swinging from a lamppost with piano wire. So I do think it's there. It's just the fact that there is a huge disconnect between what the people want and what the police service, or should it be a force, is giving them.
Hi. So one small comment and one question. So firstly on the trains. So for me, what bothers me is not just, the people playing loud music and the people keeping their feet up on the seats, but it's also just the announcements on the trains that are like, don't abuse our staff. And then they're very jollily kind of concluded with, you'll face prosecution. Which just makes you feel like whatever you do, you're just going to be prosecuted for assault. And then my question is kind of related to this gentleman's question, which is, I've heard that in Bournemouth, they've started organizing like a citizens police force. I just wondered, what is the attitude of the police towards these private groups that are forming?
I suppose maybe there's so many great points there, and I honestly think that all of them are necessary. But to start with the gentleman's comment on civic pride, I think that's fundamental to what's gone wrong, particularly in Ireland. I think a lot of Irish people have been told for a long time that we are racist. We have a Nigerian lady a grifter really, who's called Ibun Joseph, who is a racism czar. So her entire job is to categorise how Irish people are racist, despite bizarrely having chosen to live in Ireland. I do think that the sense of national pride is, the new N word is nearly nationalism, isn't it? Like, you can't really be proud of your country. Like, our own Taoiseach Micheál Martin basically said that saying that Ireland is for Irish people is tantamount to incitement to violence. Now, I used to live in Japan and South Korea, and you would see nationalist rallies all the time. Like, obviously a lot of that rage in Japan was kind of directed towards Koreans and Chinese, which, like, I'm not so, but I just never felt that seeing a national pride of a national flag flown with pride in a country was anything close to violence. I think that this suggestion that British people, like, you've obviously seen the reaction to the Raise the Flags movement. Like, we have had our own smaller version of it, and the reaction has been to have even local councillors from the Green Party going around, like, taking them down. Now, I don't know why somebody who's elected to represent the Irish people would ever think that taking a tricolour down from a lamppost was part of their job description. But yeah, here we are. And quickly to address the question about women's personal safety implements in Ireland. I don't know about the UK, but in Ireland it's actually illegal to possess pepper spray. It is illegal under the Offensive Weapons and Firearms Act. So look, we don't really have much of an option. I know that some girls are resorting to carrying deep heat spray because I believe that does burn. Yeah.
On the point about littering and some of the general points, I agree entirely with the gentleman. I mean, if there's one thing I can tell you from spending a lot of time chatting to the British public, is the British public are actually deeply authoritarian. In fact, in ways lots of people in this room might not like, quite how authoritarian. I mean, you saw that during COVID. There's around a quarter of the public that would still like us to be in lockdown if they could. And I often say, if you want to bump a poll question by 20%, just add the word ban in it, because Brits love banning things. But I think there is something there that you can sort of play on. The civic pride point, I think, is really important. And I think there is a sense, I think there's a two-way thing here, that the extent to which we have, particularly in post-industrial towns, allowed local high streets, local civic heritage sites to decline, makes then people think there is nothing worth protecting or taking pride in, which in turn then makes crime and antisocial behaviour worse. The flip side is, when I would do focus groups around levelling up, people would say, well, there's no point because it'll just be trashed in a couple of weeks. So the two go hand in hand. Just a point, maybe just to try and raise a tiny bit of disagreement on the panel here, which is to Rory's point. I mean, I accept, and I think it is entirely right, and it drives people mad when there is seen to be an over focus on things like equality, diversity, and inclusion. I would also say you've got to be a bit careful on something like that when it comes to policing, when having understanding of particular communities matters. And one of the examples I would give is, some of you will remember the case of Stephen Port, who was the grinder killer, who was killing, young men across London, and was, a lot of the deaths were dismissed by the police as just, gay people using drugs. Had police had more awareness, you would hope that would have been tackled. And I think there are other examples when it comes to situations around domestic abuse or particular cultural contexts where it can help. Now, this is all about balance, right? You don't want to go too far with this stuff. But my worry sometimes when we talk about this is we assume that all work on EDI and cultural understanding is bad, when I think what we mean is we want to redress the balance and make sure we're talking about respect and understanding rather than privileging particular groups.
Okay. Just to the gentleman's point about economic disadvantage and whether that's fueling crime, I mean, it made me think of, I don't know if many people saw the video that Robert Jenrick put on Twitter of him intervening when people were pushing through the barriers on London transport. And it was kind of showing how the TfL staff weren't doing anything. And it really went viral because I think it's something so many of us have seen. And he was stopping people that were doing it. And it seemed to be mostly youngish men that were pushing through the barriers. And I kind of had mixed feelings about that video because there's a kind of section of the slightly authoritarian right that were just like, they're absolute scum and get them. And I was thinking, but, these might be men who are finding it very difficult to pay their rent in London, are working or commuting into their job every day, finding that they have barely enough money at the end of the month, seeing that all their taxes that they're paying are going on asylum hotels, and they've just thought to themselves, and they're seeing other people pushing through the barriers, and they've just thought to themselves, well, I want to save an extra 50 quid or 100 quid a month, and I'm just going to try and do this as much as possible to save money. So I kind of, I wasn't sure about that video because there is this other side of what's happening to people, particularly young people living in London, and how hard it is. So while I'm, obviously I'm against, I see people pushing through the barriers and it really annoys me, and I sort of think, why am I paying it? But it is hard out there for people at the moment, particularly young people, and I don't know if that extreme shaming of that low level behaviour in that way is, I'm not sure about it. That was my fault because of the economic disadvantages and how difficult the job market is and everything like that. I'm not saying what they're doing is okay, but I don't know. That was just my fault.
Okay, well, just on the last point, I think Amy sort of touched upon inadvertently some of my opening comments, which is that there's always criminality has to be seen within a context at the expense of moral autonomy, and that even if there are tight economic circumstances, it's people still have a sense of what is right and wrong, or should have a sense of what is right or wrong. And I think the other problem with that kind of line of argument is that you do a grave disservice to people who are poor, who are struggling to get by, because it kind of automatically assumes that they will just go out and rob because they have a lack of income, which is slightly sort of disrespectful, I think, to people on kind of low income. I think on some of the other points that have been raised, at the front, should citizens enforce norms of antisocial behaviour? Yes, within reason, as long as they don't become sort of vigilantes, because another part of regenerating the social contract, of course, is to make sure the police are doing their job of enforcing sort of laws and norms in society. I did like Amy's point in her introduction of anarcho-tyranny, which does sort of sum up what's happening at the moment, which actually also feeds into the gentleman's at the front's point, because you have a ridiculous situation whereby the police will charge someone on the grounds that they might hypothetically invoke public order disputes, hence the arrest of the man who sort of burned the Quran outside the Turkish embassy, the fact that Tel Aviv Maccabi fans are not allowed to attend a football match on the ground that they may sort of whip up a public order issue. So yes, I completely agree with that point that you were making. And that sort of leads to one other point I want to make, is what is sort of driving this, because there is an acute awareness that the state seems to be operating in a sort of very odd direction. Why is it incapable of holding the social contract? Why is it incapable of kind of holding up the laws? And I think what it's based upon, this is something that I think Luke inadvertently touched upon, is how the state sees itself compared to ordinary citizens. There's been a big sea change in British society. Luke mentioned that the British people are sort of quite authoritarian, but that sort of view that the average British citizen are quite sort of reactionary and quite sort of old-fashioned, it's that mentality that has seeped into the state. It's the belief that the ordinary citizens are just sort of reactionary, loathsome bigots, and I think that's what's pushed the state to enforce the laws and police society in the way that it does. That we are viewed as the problem because we're the ones who are potentially sort of reactionary, and we're the ones who potentially hold views that the state sort of now disapproves of. And I think that's what's driving the sort of two-tier policing, very much which what Jacob Reynolds has said, that the state seems to be organising against our interests, which is why the social contract has unravelled.
Thank you. I think just back to Luke's point, I suppose, this whole issue of EDI and diversity, and do we want a police force that looks like the census population, just a huge red herring, a huge distraction from basic competence in policing, basic competence around the mission. It gives the leaders something that they can just go off, look busy, but actually does it make any of our streets safer? No, it doesn't. So for me, I think, we're at risk of just obviously ending up in all of these isms when actually we just need basic competence. The civic kind of sort of pride point, I think, is just as we want the public to sort of rebuild pride in their local neighbourhoods, so too we need the police, for instance, to regain pride in and own a sense of ownership of their local areas. And so, for example, in London, we've seen obviously the super boroughs produced. So, once upon a time, I might have worked in Lambeth or Wandsworth. I'd identify as being a Lambeth officer or a Wandsworth officer. Now, the different areas of London are carved up into these sort of completely meaningless South area West and Central North South. Well, what are these places? Who lives in West? Where is West area? Is that the West End? No, it's not. It's some other part of London. So for me, there's just some of this sort of human kind of psychology almost that the policing just completely forgotten. So for me, it would be about restoring localism into policing. So just as we're hearing all of the chiefs get together and talk about merging forces, because that's the answer to build bigger empires that are ever more distant from the people, we should be going the other way. It wasn't so long ago, pre-74 or pre-64 even, where we had up to, more than 100 police forces, local constabularies. So Thames Valley, which is now three huge counties, major conurbations, you used to have Reading Borough Police, Oxford City Police, Oxfordshire Constabulary. There's no reason why, particularly with technology in the way it is nowadays, that you couldn't achieve all of the benefits, the supposed benefits of having a sort of joined up police force, whilst retaining a real local link. So for me, that's something I rail against often, is this sort of idea that mergers and economies of scale will deliver us from evil. And just to this lady's point in the front about probation, I mean, I think the real tragedy often is for those who do have drug problems, that there's such little emphasis upon recovery. This idea that, the answers are to either legalise drugs and just that'll somehow solve everything, even though we've seen, you look at any of the west coast of the US, you just see the disaster that turns into. But also this mythical idea associated with it that, but the tax revenues will be able to fund into... we're dreaming. From the conversations I've been privy to with the Treasury, the Cabinet Office Number 10 and others, money for crime and justice, it disappears. I mean, it just disappears. And particularly if you imagine the Home Office at the moment, they're two big budget areas, immigration and, let's say, policing, public safety. Well, so long as we don't stop the boats, that's where the money's going. So the final thing, just to say for me, is we need a proper change in Parliament. We need parliamentarians who actually care as much about crime and disorder as we do.
And so there's a little bit more time. So if you can keep your comments brief, I'll be able to get everyone in who wants to speak.
Ewan Grant, ex-law enforcement, but I was customs and excise, not police. The gentleman's point about the need for localism, Ian Rankin makes that a very, very powerful point in relation to his dealings and observations of Police Scotland. He pulls no punches. My question is, I believe, this is obviously simplifying a good bit, that frankly, in the new culture of where significant parts of the population don't really follow the social code, you might say, social restrictions on behaviour, that the senior management of the police, and I do mean senior management, haven't really kept up, and that frankly, they're not in the same calibre as, for instance, senior members of the armed forces. Sometimes quite embarrassingly so. Others are outstanding. I've met them. So how do you think we need to get in more outside players embedded in the police to a point, not exclusively, and also a wider group of citizens groups who can keep a watch but also contribute? It's a nuanced question. It's not a magic bullet solution question. Thank you.
I'm Charlie Peters. I work for GB News. Earlier this year, I accidentally got the former chair of the Met Police Federation sacked, and I still feel very guilty about it because he gave me an interview in which he said that some Met Police officers were feeling nervous about engaging with some ethnic minority communities for fear of vexatious complaints. And I think, police officers supported what he said, but still he was suspended and then later removed from that position. The question to the panel is, to what extent are we seeing police forces almost engaging in sectarian policing? They are nervous to engage with some communities. They speak quite openly about communities in their press releases. The Met did it today, talking about a man who was questioned about his Star of David, which is the Telegraph has covered today. And one other point for Rory specifically, there's an officer in Lambeth, I don't know what that is, central, south, north maybe, but he keeps arresting people, and the Met keep putting out videos of him arresting people for shoplifting. They treat him as if he's very special and unique. Perhaps they could learn a few things from how popular those posts are.
So I'll try to keep this as brief as possible. Hearing some of the discussion surrounding, I guess, one of the comments about the innate authoritarianism of the British public and some of the examples that was thrown around of and of sort of the lawlessness in looking at other nations as well, and the role of the state as opposed to sort of social, local checking and regulation between ourselves. What are sort of the thoughts on the panel regarding El Salvador and Bukele, which is obviously one of the biggest examples in terms of, on the global scale, in terms of recent news of policing and the role of prisons and the state of the prisons there, and whether, you know, what the panel's thoughts are basically on that situation, and how you know, we here in Britain can look and see, you know, is this something, you know, is there something to learn from that, or is it, you know, a situation where it is an authoritarian, you know, system that is you know, against human rights and so forth and so forth. But yeah, I'd be really interested to know the opinions on the panel.
Hi, thank you. Just a question about the violent crime statistics being apparently going down. I think the potential violent crime incidents are actually going up, but it's just that we take ourselves out of those situations now. There are places that I won't go by myself. There are parks I won't walk in. There are streets I won't walk down. There are cities I wouldn't go to by myself, especially after dark. And that's not just a thing that women do now, and men do that as well. And the state encourages us to modify our behaviour in that way. We see lines drawn next to the roads in London saying to stay out of arm's reach of bikes passing so your phone doesn't get stolen. and we see signs warning about thieves being in the area and to make sure you keep a hand on your bags. So instead of actually policing the crimes, it feels like ordinary citizens are having their behaviour policed, and we're encouraged to modify how we act. And yes, that we're taking ourselves out of situations where we feel we might encounter violence, but violent crime isn't actually going down at all.
Do you think that the Macpherson report in 1999 influenced how the police deals with crime? And do you think that that relates to our conversation now? And also, do you think that the it might be a silly thing for me to say, but do you think that the education system has some responsibility for the rise of crime in this country?
Sorry, I didn't want to hug the mic, but it was something I forgot last time. You mentioned populism. The isms are bad. If it's not racism, it's populism, it's nationalism. Just a thing to take away is maybe instead of thinking of it as populism, bad thing, like the government's trying to deal with populism was what you said, like it's a bad thing. It's like on the Titanic, when it hit an iceberg, the people on the bottom deck knew the ship was taking on water before the people at the top realised that they'd actually done it, and they thought the ship was unsinkable. Maybe instead of debating whether we've hit an iceberg or not at the top, don't call it populism, call it crowdsourcing.
Okay, I'm going to invite my panel to sum up the discussion, which I think has been, or to make their final comments. I think it's been a very interesting conversation. I'm going to ask them to speak in the opposite order to the first order that they spoke in. So, Fatima first.
I think in terms of crimes, Ireland doesn't actually do. You have racial statistics, don't you, for crimes? We don't do that now. So yeah, I can't really tell you what the kind of the breakdown of the demographics behind because Ireland, we are experiencing particularly an increase in sexual crime reporting. Now, when my colleague Gary Kavanagh actually went to the Irish Police Force and asked them why this was, they said that it's not because more ladies mostly are being attacked. It's because more ladies now have confidence in the police force and are happy to go and report that they've been attacked. And then when we asked them what this was based on, they basically fobbed us off for 3 years, I think. Yeah. And then with regard to we don't really have you call it BAME, don't you? The inclusiveness of the RAF and stuff like that. We actually don't really have that. However, we do have a system now where the police actually went and were holding a recruitment drive at a Dublin. It's an Islamic centre. I believe it was the biggest mosque in Europe, that has alleged links to the Muslim Brotherhood. And our police force went and did a bit of a recruitment drive there. They're also doing things where I think Charlie pointed to where they're essentially like. I think handling with kid gloves people just because they're not Irish, like they're not Irish, and then somehow Irish law doesn't apply to them the way it applies to me, which I think is ridiculous. I think, look, if you come to someone else's country, you integrate or you go home. I think that's how I lived when I was in Japan. I learned Japanese. I didn't do anything. I wasn't asking Japanese people to, orientate their world around me just for the privilege of having me there. So yeah, I just think I think this is all crazy, to be honest.
I think Charlie's point was a really important one, because I think the moment that the police stop, or that people think the police have stopped policing without fear or favour, is when trust in policing breaks down. And I also think that's why the Macpherson report and its conclusions were so important, because they pointed to an investigation, a racist murder that wasn't properly investigated because of institutional racism within the police force. So I think it was important, and I think that stuff does matter. Does that mean that the same conclusions would be made today? Well, clearly not. And it was interesting, the Casey review had a slightly different perspective, but I put a lot of stock in what Louise says, because I think she is a very good troubleshooter. On the point about El Salvador, I have to say, look, I think we've, all of us on this panel and in the audience have reported there are lots of things that we don't like about the state of law and criminality in the UK at the moment. I still would not be prepared to trade it off and sacrifice due process and have people rounded up into super prisons. So I hope what we can do, and discussions like this are part of it, are set the pathway for us avoiding that type of thing. But I do think, and this ties in with the point about populism, if people continue to feel unheard and not listened to, then they will turn to more authoritarian solutions as a result. And I think we should recognise that. And on the point about populism, I entirely agree with you. Look, I think it should be mandatory for all politicians and civil servants to have to listen to focus groups more so they understood what ordinary people think. My point about the government and mitigating populism was presumably about, was particularly about Labour's challenge with Reform UK. And if they want to address Reform UK, which you assume Keir Starmer does, starting to listen to people might be one way to go about it.
Thank you. I mean, the point about Macpherson report, I think, is really important, as is, I think, this other issue sort of raised by Charlie about sort of sectarianism and policing. I mean, I think that there's never really been a reckoning of multiculturalism with policing. There's never really been that reckoning. And the closest we've come was sort of Macpherson, which basically just, the late judge ended up going down the institutional racism road. Whereas if you actually read the full report, if you actually look into what went on, so much of it is just basic incompetence. Did anyone administer decent first aid on Stephen Lawrence? Not really. From when you read the report, do we conclude therefore the ambulance were institutionally racist? Or perhaps practice was just different then. So for me, again, I think we often mistake. We get caught into this sort of, let's be politically correct, let's look at equality and diversity and inclusion, when actually we're avoiding those more difficult conversations. It's the same thing. Why did grooming gangs go on as long as they did? Even when Channel 4 aired it way back when, that just ended up swept under the carpet. So I think we've got to be braver in having conversations. And I think populism, for want of a better term at the minute, I think that's a good sign of those honest conversations coming through. And hopefully more and more people will stop sort of maligning that populist sort of uprising. And so, yeah, for me, basically, in terms of the broader question, I think we need to have police making more arrests of criminals, ideally not thought criminals, ideally not sort of, hurty-wordy criminals, but actual criminals. And we need to see more of the prolific offenders put where we know they are prevented from committing crime against the rest of us, which is in prison. So for me, hopefully in the next general election, we see manifestos that are really clear on this. And then we see the delivery. And my big fear probably is that if that delivery doesn't follow, then where do we end up?
Just to clarify my comments about the fare dodgers, I don't think they should be treated any differently because they're poor or struggling. I don't think that should be mitigating circumstances. And I think they should be dealt with by the police or TfL staff. But I guess I was just making a general point that if we have a growing population of people, particularly young people, who see that they have no stake in society, they can't get a house, they see a sense of injustice everywhere, antisocial behaviour will go up. I think it should be dealt with, but it just will go up. And just to come back to the comments about different races being treated differently, I get very annoyed when people talk about bobbies on the beat and the police officers kind of getting to know the community. Peter Hitchens does this a lot. He talks about bringing bobbies back on the beat. And I don't see how that can be possible anymore when we don't have a community. We have siloed off communities who are just keep themselves to themselves, and they don't want to know the police, and they want to. I mean, when people talk about intervening in crimes, or if you see a crime, you should say something or do something. I feel when I'm on the tube, I see people who seem to me to have completely different cultural and religious references to me. I don't even know if they speak the same language as me. Often they don't. The idea that I would sort of get involved with the people that I don't know what I'm dealing with. I don't know what their sense of morality is. They're so foreign to me. The idea that a police officer could somehow get to know all of these different people, I just think we're way past that. That's just my thought.
It's been a really useful discussion this afternoon. Some excellent comments from the floor. On the Macpherson report, I think that has been the root cause of a lot of problems with policing at the moment. The main problem with the Macpherson report is that it redefined racism from being one about discrimination and something objective to something subjective, because it says that the police need to focus on unwitting racism, or the police were guilty of unwitting, unintentional bias or unwitting prejudice. And that ended up being sort of how racism was sort of redefined, which laid the basis for a lot of the hate speech laws that we've got now. And as a consequence of the Macpherson report, this is why the police are so overzealous in policing hate speech, because they want to prove that they've distanced themselves from their sort of bad old ways, which is the root cause of a lot of the problems in terms of focusing on policing opinions rather than policing sort of criminal behaviour. On the other question, do schools have a responsibility? I think schools, like other institutions, should have the confidence to morally judge and to be prepared to say what is bad behaviour. As I started off on my introduction to talk, that's what we need to sort of centre back on, is we have to have the confidence to judge, and we have the confidence to say that is wrong as a way forward out of this morass that we are currently going through.
Thank you very much. Now you can thank